that buried the one thing keeping 87 homes from flooding, then acted surprised when I refused to fix the problem for them. That's the short version. The longer version starts with a snowstorm, a drainage pipe, and a homeowners association that spent months treating me like I didn't matter because my house happened to sit at the bottom of the hill. My name is Wade Mercer. I'm 59 years old, retired now, and I live in a little place outside Ashford Ridge, Vermont. If you've ever driven through one of those hillside developments where every house looks like it belongs in a real estate brochure, you know the type. Big windows, fresh siding, perfect driveways, matching mailboxes, everything neat enough to make you wonder if people actually live there. My house is not one of those houses. Mine was built long before the development existed. It's tucked down at the base of the slope beneath a stand of old maple trees. The porch creaks when the weather changes. The gravel driveway grows weeds every summer, no matter how often I pull them. And honestly, that's exactly why I bought it. After my divorce 15 years ago, I got tired of noise, tired of people, tired of pretending I enjoyed neighborhood barbecues with folks I barely knew. I wanted quiet. Down here, I had plenty of it. At least I did for a while. Most people looking at my property would never notice the drainage intake sitting near the edge of my backyard. In summer, it's hidden behind tall grass and blackberry bushes. In winter, it's buried beneath snow. It isn't pretty, just a concrete opening covered by a steel grate, connected to a stormwater system installed decades ago. But that ugly little structure is important. Every road, driveway, and yard in the development above me slopes downhill toward that intake. Rainwater goes there. Melting snow goes there. Everything goes there. Back in the early 80s, when developers carved the hillside into residential lots, they couldn't get approval without creating a drainage easement across what would later become my property. The agreement was simple. The community could use the drainage system, but they were responsible for keeping access clear and preventing obstructions. I didn't think much about that clause when I bought the house. For over a decade, there was no reason to. Then came last winter. Now, if you've lived in New England long enough, you learn that snow has personalities. Some storms leave behind light powder. Some leave wet concrete disguised as snowflakes. Last winter felt like Mother Nature had a personal grudge against everyone. Storm after storm rolled through. The development hired a new snow removal contractor that season. Big company, new equipment, bright orange trucks that looked expensive enough to have their own accountants. The first time I noticed something strange, I was splitting firewood behind my shed. I heard the scrape of plow blades somewhere above me, then the low growl of diesel engines. Nothing unusual there. Then I looked up. A massive wall of snow suddenly slid over the embankment and came tumbling into my yard. I just stood there holding an axe, watching it settle across the drainage area. At first, I honestly thought it was an accident. Then it happened again and again. A few days later, I caught one of the drivers before he pulled away. "Hey," I shouted. He rolled down his window. "You can't dump that down here." The guy looked confused. "We were told this is where it goes." "Who told you that?" "The HOA manager." Then he shrugged and drove off. That little conversation sat in my head longer than it should have. Because here's the thing. Nobody had ever asked me. Nobody had ever called. Nobody had ever knocked on my door and said, "Hey, Wade, we're planning to use your property as a snow storage site this winter." They just decided. By February, the pile sitting over the drainage intake was nearly 12 feet high. It looked less like a snowbank and more like a glacier trying to start a new life in my backyard. I started taking pictures, not because I was angry, not yet, mostly because something about it felt reckless. And deep down, a part of me had the uncomfortable feeling that sooner or later, somebody was going to learn an expensive lesson. I just didn't know who it was going to be. Then the temperatures started rising. The snow began to melt, and that's when everything changed. The first signs were easy to ignore. A little water here, a little standing puddle there. Nothing dramatic, at least not at first. Around mid-March, we got one of those strange Vermont warm spells where the temperature jumps 20 degrees overnight, and the entire world seems to start dripping at once. Icicles turned into waterfalls. Snowbanks shrank by the hour. Every rooftop in the development above me sounded like it was quietly leaking. All that water had one destination: my backyard. The problem was the intake was still buried. Months of plowed snow had compacted into a dense block of ice directly over the grate. Water reached it and had nowhere to go. Instead of flowing through the drainage system, it spread outward. The next morning, I walked into my basement carrying a basket of laundry and immediately stopped. My boots made a sound they weren't supposed to make. Squish. I looked down. Water. Cold water stretched across the concrete floor. Not much. Maybe half an inch. But enough. I set the basket down and stared at it for a moment, trying to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. Old houses leak sometimes. That's what I told myself. By evening, the water was almost 2 inches deep. That was when I started moving things. Boxes, tools, storage bins, anything sitting on the floor. The furnace worried me most. It was only 4 years old and sitting low enough that another few inches could turn a bad day into a disaster. I spent half the night running extension cords and hauling things onto shelves. The next morning, I called the HOA. The president was a man named Preston Hale. You know the type. Always calm, always polished, always speaking like every conversation is a board meeting. Wade, he said cheerfully after answering. What can I do for you? You can stop burying my drainage intake. Silence. Then a small laugh. I beg your pardon? My basement flooded. The intake is buried under 12 feet of snow your contractor dumped there. His tone changed slightly. Snow removal is handled by our maintenance department. That's funny because the water doesn't seem to care who handles it. Another pause. I'll have someone look into it. That someone turned out to be the community operations manager, a woman named Lauren Bishop. Lauren arrived 2 days later carrying a clipboard and the kind of expression people wear when they've already decided what they're going to say before they arrive. She walked around the property, looked at the snow mound, looked at the intake, then looked at me. This is currently the most efficient storage area available. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe she said it out loud. The most efficient for who? She ignored the question. The drainage structure itself appears undamaged. My furnace doesn't. The structure remains functional. It can't function if it's buried. She made a note on her clipboard. That was the moment I realized we were speaking different languages. I was talking about consequences. She was talking about technicalities. The following week, the basement flooded again. Worse this time. Water reached the furnace. The repair bill alone made my stomach hurt. Then came the third flood. That one got personal. I had several storage containers tucked away in the back corner of the basement. Old photographs, family keepsakes, letters from my father, things I'd carried through multiple moves without ever throwing away. Water got into every single box. I spent hours sitting on the floor opening albums page by page. Photos stuck together, ink bleeding, faces fading. There's something uniquely painful about watching memories physically disappear. You can't repair them. You can't replace them. Once they're gone, they're gone. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring out the window at the giant mound of snow covering the intake. For a long time, I didn't move. Didn't turn on the television. Didn't read. Didn't even make coffee. I just sat there thinking. Anger is interesting. People imagine it arrives all at once, like an explosion. In reality, sometimes it arrives quietly. It settles in, becomes heavier every day. What finally pushed me over the edge wasn't the flooding. It wasn't even the furnace. It was the realization that nobody cared because the consequences were happening to me instead of them. As long as the water stayed in my basement, life up the hill remained comfortable. That realization changed everything. The next morning, I opened an old filing cabinet in my office. Inside were property records, tax documents, inspection reports, and a stack of paperwork I'd barely looked at since buying the house. Eventually, I found the drainage easement. I sat down and started reading. Slowly, line by line, twice, then a third time. One sentence practically jumped off the page. The association shall maintain unobstructed access to the drainage intake and prevent blockage of the system. Prevent blockage, not respond to blockage. Prevent it. That distinction mattered. A lot. For the next several weeks, I documented everything. Photos, videos, repair estimates, flood damage, weather reports, contractor invoices. I built a file thick enough to stop a bullet. Then I requested a meeting. The HOA office sat near the entrance of the development in a building designed to look friendlier than it actually was. Everything inside was beige. The walls, the carpet, even the furniture looked beige somehow. Preston sat at one end of the conference table. Lauren sat beside him with her clipboard. I brought the easement agreement. After a few minutes of small talk, Preston folded his hands. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish today, Wade? I slid the document across the table. Read paragraph 6. Lauren looked first, then Preston. Neither appeared happy. The community has utilized this system for decades, Preston said, not while violating the agreement. The intake remains operational. No, it doesn't. The structure itself is intact. My flooded basement disagrees. Lauren leaned forward. Mr. Mercer, snow accumulation is a natural occurrence. I nodded. Sure, but plowing 12 feet of snow directly onto critical infrastructure isn't. For the first time all afternoon, nobody had an answer ready. The room went quiet. Finally, Preston cleared his throat. If you've suffered damages, you're free to pursue legal remedies. There it was, the polite version of good luck. I gathered my paperwork, stood up, and looked directly at both of them. You've got 6 weeks before the main spring melt. Preston offered a thin smile. We'll take your concerns under advisement. I remember walking back to my truck feeling strangely calm. Not defeated, not angry. Calm. Because something important had become clear. They thought I was bluffing. They thought I would complain. Maybe threaten a lawsuit. Then eventually give up. And honestly, I could understand why. Most people do. But what they didn't understand was that I'd spent 30 years running a fabrication company. I understood contracts. I understood liability. And most importantly, I understood leverage. That evening, I called an old friend named Roy Bennett. Roy had retired from steel fabrication a few years earlier. After listening to the whole story, he stayed quiet for several seconds. Then he asked one simple question. How big is the intake opening? I smiled, because for the first time in months, somebody was asking exactly the right question. And that's when the real fight began. Roy came over the next morning carrying a tape measure, a thermos of coffee, and the kind of grin that usually meant somebody was about to get themselves into trouble. We spent an hour measuring the intake. The opening wasn't huge, but it was important. Roy crouched beside the grate, scratched his beard, and looked up at me. You know what this thing really needs? A miracle? A gate. That was the first time I'd smiled in weeks. 3 days later, sparks were flying inside Roy's workshop. Steel plates, heavy hinges, reinforced brackets, everything built to survive weather, abuse, and a whole lot of angry opinions. By the time we finished, the gate looked like something you'd put on a bank vault instead of a drainage intake, which was exactly why I liked it. While Roy worked on the steel, I worked on paperwork. I added up every expense. Flood remediation, furnace repairs, property damage, equipment rentals, professional inspections, replacement costs. The number wasn't small. Neither was the evidence supporting it. Then I drafted a formal demand package. Professional, detailed, painfully specific. Along with compensation for damages, I included requirements for future compliance, annual maintenance obligations, documented snow management procedures, and consequences for future violations. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was trying to make sure this never happened again. There's a difference. The gate went up on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Roy helped bolt it directly over the intake structure. When the lock clicked shut, the sound echoed through the yard. Solid. Final. I installed a small metal sign beside it. Drainage access suspended due to easement violations. Then I mailed the paperwork. Certified delivery. Signature required. The phone rang that same evening. Preston. His voice was considerably less cheerful than before. Wade, what exactly do you think you're doing? Protecting my property. You can't block critical infrastructure. I leaned back in my chair. Interesting argument. Because apparently you can bury it under 12 feet of snow. His breathing got heavier. This is outrageous. 3 floods were outrageous. This affects the entire community. So we did your decisions. The call ended badly. The next several days got worse. Lawyers became involved. Threats started appearing. Not direct threats. The polished kind. The expensive kind. Letters filled with words like unreasonable and unauthorized. I read every one of them. Then I read the easement again. And every time I reached the same conclusion. The association had obligations. Those obligations hadn't been met. Meanwhile, spring kept moving closer. The weather forecast became impossible to ignore. Warmer temperatures, heavy runoff, rapid snowmelt. Every prediction pointed toward the same outcome. A lot of water was coming. News travels fast in neighborhoods. Soon residents started showing up on my property. Some were angry. Some were curious. Most simply wanted answers. One afternoon, a couple named Ethan and Maria Walker stopped by, carrying coffee. They lived halfway up the hill. We honestly had no idea, Maria admitted. No idea about what? The snow dumping. I nodded. Most of them didn't. People assume systems work. Until they don't. As the days passed, more homeowners began asking questions. Questions the HOA didn't want to answer. Why wasn't this addressed earlier? Why were legal notices being exchanged? Why was the drainage system suddenly at risk? Pressure started building. Not on me, on them. Then came the emergency community meeting. The clubhouse was packed. Every chair occupied. People standing along walls. The atmosphere felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Preston stood at the front, looking exhausted. Lauren sat nearby, surrounded by documents. When they started explaining the situation, the room became restless almost immediately. One homeowner raised his hand. Are we seriously finding out about this now? Another asked why snow had been stored near the intake in the first place. Then another, and another. The questions kept coming. For the first time since this entire mess began, the board wasn't controlling the conversation. The residents were. Eventually someone pointed toward me. Wait, is this true? Every eye in the room turned. I stood up slowly. I wasn't interested in making a speech. I simply told them what happened. The flooding, the damage, the ignored warnings, the easement, nothing more, nothing less. By the time I sat down, the room felt different. Not because everyone agreed with me. Some didn't, but now they understood. And understanding changes things. 3 days later, the warm front arrived. The kind of weather event every New England homeowner recognizes immediately. Snow started disappearing fast. Water appeared everywhere. Road edges, ditches, driveways, lawns. Streams of runoff began flowing downhill from every direction. Toward the intake, toward the locked gate. I stood outside watching as water spread across the area. At first it pooled slowly, then faster. By sunset, sections of roadway near the upper development were beginning to collect standing water. My phone rang. Preston. Again. Only this time he sounded different. Not confident. Not irritated. Worried. Wade, we need to resolve this. I watched water moving across the hillside. I tried resolving it months ago. Residents are concerned. I was concerned 3 floods ago. A long silence followed. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting to hear. What do you need? That conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. The negotiations that followed lasted almost 48 hours. Lawyers exchanged drafts. Board members argued. Insurance representatives became involved. Nobody slept much. Then, finally, an agreement was reached. Compensation for damages. Formal maintenance obligations. Annual oversight requirements. New snow handling procedures. Written accountability measures. Everything documented. Everything signed. The next challenge was the snow mound itself. Because despite all the agreements, the original obstruction was still sitting there. That night, floodlights appeared on the hillside. Heavy equipment followed. Excavators, loaders, dump trucks. The same contractor that had spent months pushing snow downhill suddenly became very interested in hauling it away. Funny how motivation works. Lauren arrived shortly after dark. For the first time, she looked less like an administrator and more like someone carrying the weight of several difficult lessons. Together we watched crews tear into the frozen pile. Hour after hour, truck after truck, until finally the intake emerged. The concrete structure looked almost strange after being buried so long. Lauren inspected it carefully. Everything was clear. Everything documented. Then she stood up and nodded. We're good. I looked at the email on my phone. The revised procedures had arrived. Signed. Approved. Official. For a moment, I just stood there holding the key. Not because I wanted to drag it out, because the moment felt bigger than the lock itself. This was never really about a drainage pipe. It was about being ignored, about being treated like the consequences didn't matter because they landed on the wrong property. Finally, I slid the key into the lock, turned it. Click. The gate swung open. Almost immediately, water rushed forward. The intake swallowed it in great swirling currents. Within minutes, pooling water began disappearing. Roadways started clearing. The pressure that had been building across the hillside finally released. A little later, Preston called one last time. The exhaustion in his voice was impossible to miss. We should have handled this differently. I looked out across the dark yard. Yeah, I said quietly. You should have. That was over 3 years ago. Today, the drainage system is inspected regularly. Snow gets hauled away instead of dumped downhill. The paperwork gets reviewed every fall. And every winter, I receive updated management plans before the first major storm arrives. The basement has stayed dry ever since. Sometimes after a snowfall, I stand on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch the plows work. They keep their distance now. Nobody dumps anything near the intake. Nobody pretends the easement doesn't exist. Funny thing is, some people still think I went too far. Others think I didn't go far enough. And honestly, maybe that's why this story still gets debated. So let me ask you this. If your home had flooded 3 times because people ignored a legal agreement, would you have locked that gate? Or would you have kept quiet for the sake of neighborhood harmony? Was I protecting my property or holding an entire community hostage until they paid attention? I'd really like to hear where you stand on that, because depending on who you ask, I'm either the stubborn old guy who saved his home or the stubborn old guy who forced 87 families to learn a lesson the hard way. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where doing the right thing made you look like the bad guy, share your story too. I'd love to read it.